After Nestle, FSSAI issues notices to 8 brands for misleading trade names, healthy claims. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Then Nestle got caught selling products with misleading names, and suddenly everyone's watching. Now FSSAI has issued enforcement notices to 8 more brands for the exact same violation, and here's what that tells us about how India's food labeling actually works. First, the immediate signal: FSSAI isn't just warning anymore. They're escalating. After the Nestle case became public, they launched a systematic audit of major brands' claims and packaging. The 8 brands now under notice range across categories, from breakfast foods to snack brands that have spent years marketing themselves as healthy or natural, when the actual ingredient lists tell a different story entirely. This is enforcement with teeth. Not a gentle advisory. A notice with legal weight. Here's what makes this significant: food labeling in India operates on a trust-first system. Companies self-certify their claims. Regulators spot check. But the gap between what a product is called and what it actually contains has been enormous. A cereal marketed as whole grain goodness might be 60% refined carbohydrate. A snack labeled natural might contain synthetic additives. Consumers see the front-of-pack marketing and assume it's regulated. It isn't, not in the way you'd expect. The regulation exists, but enforcement was sparse until now. The FSSAI's action targets 2 specific violations: misleading trade names and false health claims. Trade names are the product's actual commercial name. If a brand calls something Nature's Protein Bar, but it contains mostly sugar, that's a misleading trade name. Health claims are explicit statements like supports immunity or aids digestion without clinical backing. Both are illegal under Food Safety and Standards Act, 2006. But they've been everywhere anyway. Why now? 3 factors collide. First, FSSAI got new teeth after the Nestle case proved that enforcement was possible and would generate public attention. Second, consumer awareness about processed foods has spiked, parents are reading labels, fitness enthusiasts are fact-checking claims, and social media amplifies discrepancies. Third, the regulator faced political pressure. A food company explicitly lying on its packaging while the regulator sleeps doesn't look good. One case can be a slip. 8 cases in a follow-up audit looks like systemic neglect. Now here's the contrarian angle that matters: these notices might not change shelf behavior as much as you'd think. A notice doesn't mean immediate removal. It means the brand has to respond, potentially reformulate, and face fines if they don't comply, but that process takes months. Some brands will comply. Others will negotiate with FSSAI, tweak the language slightly, and keep the same product under a marginally different claim. The infrastructure to police this at scale doesn't exist yet. One regulator auditing thousands of SKUs across millions of products annually is practically impossible. What changes next? This becomes a precedent case for downstream brands. If FSSAI is serious, they'll need to establish clear guidelines for what constitutes a misleading health claim versus a defensible one. They'll need to codify the testing standards that brands must meet before making any immunity or digestive health claim. And they'll need to show follow-through, fines, not just notices. Without enforcement teeth, notices are theater. For consumers, the immediate action is simple: stop trusting front-of-pack marketing. Read the ingredient list. If a cereal is labeled healthy, but sugar is the second ingredient, it isn't. If a snack claims natural, but contains artificial flavors, the claim is technically false. The FSSAI notices just confirmed what skeptical consumers already knew, that the gap between packaging promise and actual content is real, wide, and until now, largely unpoliced. For brands, the signal is clearer: the era of loose health claims is contracting. New product launches will face tighter scrutiny. Existing products with exposed claims will either reformulate or rebrand. Some smaller brands that can't afford reformulation might quietly exit categories. The big plays will adapt fastest, they have compliance teams. Smaller players will feel this more sharply. The deeper implication: India's consumer protection is shifting from post-harm regulation to pre-market scrutiny. You can't just launch and hope nobody notices anymore. That's a structural change, and it will ripple through food marketing for the next 2 to 3 years. Watch for more notices. Watch for brand responses. And watch which companies comply versus which ones push back. That tells you who's serious about the consumer and who's just protecting margin. This is worth paying attention to because it's not just about Nestle or cereal. It's about what regulated actually means in India's consumer goods space, and whether regulators will finally enforce the rules they wrote. That question affects every packaged food you buy. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.